right, those of you who are TikTok fans.
Where are you going to be standing primarily?
I'm going to stand. Mouse.
No, wait a minute.
That's where I want to put
Can y'all guys see that online?
Yes,
Yeah, yes, it's clear.
perfect.
Right.
All right, begin.
I'm John. I'm a ship modeler.
Hi, John.
Those of you-
Hi, John.
Those of you know what that, especially if you've been rubbing elbows with Gene for
Yeah.
I'll give you a little perspective here. I'm always fascinated by how stuff works, and I try and find out how does it work and try and understand how things, especially in this day, and age, how they've evolved over time. And I thought it'd be a simple task to look at how naval gunnery has evolved from the earliest age to now. And it would be a couple of steps, but it didn't turn out to be that way. So what I will do is I'll try and zip through this as quickly as I can, but if I go too fast, let me know. There's a lot of words on some of the early view graphs. I don't like to do it that way, but I couldn't get my thoughts into anything less than 100 words per view graph. Now this is a very famous picture. There are actually two pictures about the same time. This is USS Missouri before she deploys to the Pacific. And what's interesting about this picture is 3 of the shells. It's her aft turret, number 3, firing. And they're 16-inch shells. So she's going through gunnery exercises down near Trinidad. So it's really the story of people. Boink. The shooter, the gun layer, all of these things have to work together to do well. And it's relatively recently that they have all worked together. It's been, as you'll see when I go through the evolution, it starts off very simply, and there's always somebody that says, I want a bigger gun. Then that goes through every part of the design of both the ship as well as the gun and the shell. So it's a moving target, so to speak. And here's the Stone Age. Here's the steps, how we got to where we are now, arbitrarily named by me to now. So the Stone Age, they literally threw rocks at each other. That's why it's the Stone Age. And that means, that kind of tells you how close the engagement is. And it didn't really start off too promising. They used catapults on naval vessels. It goes back to the time of Caesar, Julius Caesar in particular. More common in the Middle Ages. Some of these things are not all that important, I guess, but the first time we see gun ports cut into the side of a ship is 1500, 1501 type thing. Boink. Bigger guns equals bigger problems. I'm an engineer, I like to solve problems. So that's my focus here. Everybody wants bigger guns because they make bigger holes and stuff. And all of these things fall out of that that decision. Bigger guns, gun size grows, bigger projectiles, more recoil means you got to have a stronger system, more powder, the shot is heavier. All of these things affect the design and the implementation of naval gunnery. Yeah. There we go. The tactical ranges were not even a few hundred yards. It was more like 100 yards, a football field. They changed over to iron balls. I'll stand by for any jokes you may have, but I couldn't think of a better way to say it. It also required the bigger the mass that you're shooting, the more gunpowder you need. And then the chemists get involved in making each bit of gunpowder more effective. And it evolves into the ship design. The ship has to be heavier. When you look at HMS Victory, for example, the 3 decks of guns, and they're all heavy frickin' guns, you can kind of figure out what the design problem is going to be to build the ship to hold the guns. They didn't start out to be the primary weapon, but when ships' guns started to be more effective at greater ranges, they became the primary weapon, not Marines jumping over onto the other ship, for example. Okay, that's what I call the master and commander age. This is the common image of engagement at sea during the wooden ship era. And what it says over there, I'm not sure what that, if I can get rid of this.
Over to the black.
Okay. We all remember Jack Aubrey, and oh, we're going the wrong way now. We're jumping ahead. And some of his, okay, it's not important. But I thought this was kind of a funny looking thing, so I put it in. But it basically says after 3 glasses of wine with the doctor, Aubrey forgot the thing was loaded. So there's his problem. And this is kind of what a standard gun deck looked like, one of the lower gun decks. And the cannons were more or less arranged, the heavier ones at the bottom, and then they got lighter and lighter towards the top. This isn't really my fascinating era, so I'll zip through it quickly. But you can see here's the evolution of the gun. It gets bigger and bigger, and that means a bigger and bigger ship. You want to carry more and more guns. And you can just see especially with the sails and everything, what the top weight issue is here. You end up with an awful lot of useless ballast to keep things more or less upright, all because of the bigger guns. The development of the carronade, I'll talk about it again a little later, but this is a carronade here. It shoots the same size cannonball as a long gun, but it's a much smaller weapon for closer aboard, and you put them on the upper decks. They weigh less.
It has shorter range.
Yeah. It's still in the 100-yard range. Nobody's really worried about that. This is how the engagement usually goes down. It's fairly close aboard. But if you think of the problem here of the rolling and pitching of the ship and the rolling and pitching of the target and being able to hit something that'll do damage within a limited elevation range of the gun, they were lucky to hit and do much damage. And what you find is, if you look at historical records, very few ships are really sunk. They're usually dismasted or torn up, but they don't sink usually in an engagement like this. So we shoot for the sails. There were a number of different types of shells, the standard ball, canister, various things that are meant to do a certain job, like kill people or rip out rigging or try and breach the hull. And the evolved combat tactics were 2 parallel lines with guys shooting at each other as they go past each other. That was the standard ship of the line layout. And it looked like this. I mean, it's pretty simple stuff. And there was a certain gentleman's agreement, it looks to me, because this ship might be a 3rd rank, this ship might be a 1st rank, and the enemy would match rank per rank. You didn't overload, use a 1st rank ship on a 3rd rank. There's kind of a gentleman's agreement, I guess. One of the tactics that you tried to align for your own benefit is crossing the T. So these are the bad guys here. And there's the crossing of the letter T. And you bring to bear all of your thwart ship's guns. And the only guns that your enemy can bring to bear on you, unless they turn, are the chaser guns near the bow, in the first 45 degrees either side of the heading. So this is a famous tactic during history, but it didn't get used that much because everybody knew what was coming and tried to maneuver. Not everybody, I shouldn't say everybody. like I say here, there's always one asshole that does something different. This is what Horatio Nelson did. He used the ship to puncture the top of the T. So they got all the way in close before they started shooting. And it had obvious victorious effects. Okay, so in the age of sail, ships of wood, not tin, men of iron, half a pistol shot was a way of determining the distance. Muzzle loaders and the size of the gun port limits how much elevation and traverse you get. You can see some of the limitations here. And as I said before, usually you batter the ship into submission, you don't sink it. That's generally what happened. And gunnery was an art, then began the decline. If you've ever heard of the opera HMS Pinafore, it's a comedy about the Royal Navy in the 1800s, mid-1800s. It's actually based on truth. There's more truth than comedy in it because the British got to a point where they had no one else. Russell Crowe wouldn't come back, but they beat everybody in the world. They didn't have to prove anything anymore, so they just decided it was more important to have a good-looking ship than get all kinds of powder all over doing something silly like improving your gunnery accuracy. And you can see that thread in HMS Pinafore. And literally some captains were there for the brass work and the visit by the VIPs. Anyway, you get that. And where do we go from here? Well, the American Civil War is where we went from here. Somebody decided it would make sense to put sheets of iron on the sides of the ship to deflect cannonballs. And an engineer got the bright idea to throw some mechanics, Newtonian mechanics at the problem. How big a gun barrel requires how big a ball. And there was an awful lot of energy lost around the periphery of the cannonballs because they were not perfectly round. And the barrels therefore had to accept a range of shells, balls. And you had a problem with what was called windage, and they mean it differently than windage when you're shooting at a duck. But windage was the wasted energy that basically went around the ball and didn't move the ball out of the barrel. So they worked on that in the late 1700s. They're starting to home in on the idea of something a little more precise than the equivalent of just throwing rocks at an enemy. And when you do that, when you get more efficient and you get more efficient shells and guns, then you have to figure out, now that it's not going 100 yards, it's going 200 yards. Some of the problems of making sure it hits the right thing at that 200 yards become more important than they were at 100 yards. Now, this is...
Quick question.
Sure.
Use the term carronade on that.
Yeah.
What is it?
It's a small cannon. It's meant to go on the upper decks of a fighting ship and fire the same size cannonball or other ordnance as a regular long gun, but weigh a lot less because it wasn't going to shoot as far.
It can almost be seen as a cross between a mortar and a cannon.
Yeah. Now, who named it that? Probably the French.
I could add one thing to that.
Please do.
About the carronade. Carronade is truly a small cannon, but it was developed by the Caron Iron Works. So they put their name on it. It became a carronade.
Located in Caron. Located in Caron.
Oh, it's not a woman's name.
They worked on a slide rather than wheels.
Right.
It didn't recoil.
Now, if you track statistics like I do, I'm an engineer, that's what we do. you can see there's a point in time here when there's a sudden upturn right around the American Civil War. This is when you start getting ironclads, more efficient gun barrels, more better tolerance on the cannonballs or whatever the ordnance is you're shooting. And you can see that, I forget what the hell that was, the tonnage here, why we're measuring tonnage, but
Bigger ships.
it works. It works. You start to require bigger ships to shoot the bigger shell. Okay, the turret, the monitor turret, is one of two designs that were designed about the same time frame, totally out of sight of each other. The first one was actually in, was it France? I'll get to it. I haven't read this in a while. But what happened was we had two inventors that came up with basically the same idea within a few years of each other on both sides of the Atlantic. Ericsson on this side, I think it was a French designer working for the Brits on the other side. But what's happening now is the more armored ships and the heavier they are, they turn back to an age-old ship killer, and that's the ram bow. Big, pointy wedge of iron below the waterline that's meant you drive your ship into the other ship, put a big hole in the side. And some of my submarine friends used to say, when we compare things like harpoon anti-ship missiles with torpedoes, and what they would say was basically, does it make more sense to let a lot of air out of the ship, out of the top of the ship with a missile, or let a lot of water into the bottom with a torpedo? So that's what they thought was the ship killers, the torpedo lets a lot of water in the bottom. Okay, so the scientists are at work. And we're looking to get rid of these pesky sails. And that's when steam power begins to make its impact known. Here are the two different turrets. The Ericsson, this is more or less what the monitor's turret looked like. It's actually more like this, but this is the Coles turret, which was either, again, the inventor was either British or French. And you've probably seen pictures of what it looks like. We're also looking at using the same kind of Dahlgren guns. This is a characteristic shape of a Dahlgren. It's a muzzle loader, and it's got a big bulge here, which is where you contain most of the explosive force of the powder. The longer the barrel is, the higher the velocity as the shell goes out the other end. And it's just a question of weight and balance. How long do you make it? We had, in World War II, we had a number of, in the 30s before, we had a number of 5-inch guns with different barrel lengths for different purposes. The 5-inch 25, 5-inch 38, the 5-inch 50 were all relatively the same breech, but the barrels were different lengths. And of course, you've got a long barrel, it takes a lot longer to slew it around. It didn't do well against aircraft. Now, I think there's a certain sense of what looks good and what doesn't. I had a friend once tell me, if it looks good, it probably is good. If it doesn't look good, it probably won't work. And here's a perfect example here. Notice the ram bow, oops, the ram bow here on the ship. That is plug ugly. You'd never see me modeling a ship like that. I'll tell you that for sure. And of course, enough has been said about this, and this is the knee and the curve. And the big difference that this points out is you have a turret versus basically a recreation of a sailing ship without the sails. And the key point here is, in the case of Virginia, you have to aim the ship to aim the guns. In the case of the Monitor, you turn the turret and the ship can go anywhere it wants, in any direction, and you can still put fire on your enemy. That was a big change. Okay, so steam power allowed ships to go faster and range further and get to the combat area fast. with some notable exceptions. You could be more selective in your targeting, obviously. More powerful guns resulted in increased gun range, and rifle guns and pointed shells. All these things are starting to happen around the same time, and you're out to 6,000 yards by the late 1890s. That sounds like a lot, but that's 3 miles. Really not a huge range compared to what we look at today. Okay. And there's a point in time later on where increased barrel elevation is required because you need to get to about 45 degrees to get the maximum range out of a shell, tossed out of a rifle barrel. Come on. There we go. The fire control solution, as the range increases, you start to encounter problems you didn't know you had. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but there are problems with targeting that when you only are shooting 1,000 yards, you don't really notice them. When you start getting out to 6,000 to 8,000 yards, you start encountering things like the rotation of the earth, the curvature of the earth. They didn't realize why they weren't hitting the target with what seemed like a perfectly good firing solution. And the longer range means a longer flight time of the shell. It might be 25 seconds. So you got to put the shell where the ship is going to be in 25 seconds. Take into account the rolling and pitching motion of your ship. As you push the range out, you start to encounter more and more variables that, at least in the beginning of encountering them, you don't have a way of dealing with them yet because you don't have the map. Okay, and the other thing is that this is actually a parabola, not a portion of a circle, so that as the shell starts to slow down, it drops a little more precipitously. The angle of the fall is greater than the angle of departure out the barrel. And then if you're looking down, this is looking from the side. When you're looking this way, they began to notice angular drift off to the right. In the northern hemisphere, they didn't realize that it was unique to the northern hemisphere because it's to the left, south of the equator. But this is the Coriolis effect from the rotation of the Earth. And you have to, especially the further out you go, this can be a significant distance that you've got to compensate for in order to hit a ship in a place where you'll damage it rather than just ahead or behind. So what you tried to do is, in this day and age, with these kind of guns, you had basically a homing in process. You tried to straddle, first long, then short, then cut the distance in half, and the next salvo ought to drop right on top of the enemy if he hasn't maneuvered. So anyway, this is why we have engineers. Knowledge is power. The one thing to look at some of the accounts in the Spanish-American War, and the U.S. Navy had a terrible record of hits versus rounds expended. And the only thing that saved their tender young asses was the fact that the Spanish were even worse. They were about 1/2 or 1/3 as many hits per number of rounds expended as the Americans. So I think I've got it here somewhere, but the hit rate was something like 1.5%. Not overly acceptable. So one of the solutions, and you'll hear it pop up again a little bit later in this, is fire more quickly. So you go through that ranging process more quickly to get to the hitting rounds. And that led to the development in the late 1890s to early 1900s of the quick fire gun. The number of rounds per minute is what's intended here. When you have a faster firing weapon, you get to the point where you start hitting more quickly is the logic there. There's a couple of ways to get there, one of which is, well, I'll talk about it. There we go. We had some elementary mechanical fire control computers. There's a fascinating book that I got in the bookstore here at the Mariners Museum called between man and machine. And it's a story about the evolution of servos, among other things, that allowed the timeline between when you first load the shell till you get your first hit to be drastically compressed. And allowed the electronic control of guns, the elevation and the traversing, so that you got to that point quicker rather than having some mechanical means that turns the turret in the right direction. You had a much quicker rate when you could put a motor on it and have the motor slew the turret. Yep. Okay. So we were getting better and better results. But, you know, there's more to it than meets the eye. We're also seeing the result of the Industrial Revolution. We're beginning to use steel and iron in place of wood. And what that kind of gives you is more accuracy. You're able to design something to a critical dimension and then reproduce it time and time and time and time and time again, rather than a craftsman designing and building something as a one-off deal. So we're moving toward automation, and that means different things to different people. But we're still limited by the materials, but there's also, at the same time, you start with iron, and then it becomes steel. Then it becomes, in the case of armor, specially treated steel, and different thicknesses of armor are then constructed for the side armor belts and for the deck armor belts that now improves your chances of surviving if your enemy hits you before you hit. So around the early 1900s, like 1901 or 1902, it's clear something is going on in Europe, that the Germans and the Brits are going to go head to head if something doesn't change. And it doesn't. And they try and beat each other out by building as many ships as they can. The British come up with the idea of an all big gun ship, because normally up to this point in time, you have several different calibers of guns. So you've got a gun that's meant for one purpose. There were no airplanes to shoot down at that point, so you didn't worry about anti-aircraft guns. But there were torpedo boat destroyer guns, like a 3-inch gun. You had the middle caliber guns, then you had the heavy armament guns, like 12-inch was kind of the currency then. The 12-inch large bore rifled main gun. Anyway, Dreadnought in 1902 was the first ship that had a lot of big guns and very few small guns. And it was revolutionary at the time. And what they're trying to do is get the largest main battery, and you make room for the main battery by getting rid of the smaller caliber guns. And they were looking for the fastest speed. This is all relative, but fast back then was like 23 knots, 24 knots. And protection against, the assumption is always that your enemy will shoot at you with the same size caliber as you're carrying in your main armament. Not always a good combination. That's how the designs were done. So there's always a trade-off. Of those three things, large main battery, fastest speed, and armor, pick two. You can never pick all three without degrading all three of them. So choices were made. One of the British developments was the result of some of the treaties, and it was, or it led to some of the treaties, sorry, is a better way of saying it, but it led to the battle cruiser, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And in the 1920s, after World War I, and the prevailing wisdom at the time was that the war was triggered by the Germans and the British trying to outbuild each other in battleships. And it forced the war to happen because you had all this hardware, nowhere to use it unless the enemy came out and shoot at them. But one of the interesting side discussions in the Washington Naval Treaty and then the London Naval Treaty was what kind of a role do cruisers have? And the the wording in the treaties, you had two choices for cruisers. One was a smaller gun cruiser. The other is a heavy cruiser. That was outside. Heavy cruiser. And you could choose whether to have 6-inch guns or 8-inch guns or something around those two. And if you used the 6-inch gun, you could have 15 barrels. If you used the 8-inch gun, you could have 9. So if you look at the 30-0, like Indianapolis cruisers, heavy cruisers like that, you had 9 barrels of 8 inches each. But there was a subclass of light cruisers that the United States built, the Brooklyns, the Clevelands, and it escapes me at the moment. Those two ships those two classes used 6-inch 47 caliber guns that were very quick fire. They were almost 3 times as fast as the 8-inch gun. So the decision was made to build entire classes of ships with the smaller guns because the calculations showed you get more ordnance on target in a given amount of time with the smaller shells and the faster rate of fire. So we went that way. It also built some heavy cruisers, but it was the same hull, the same power plant, and it was just a question of what turret choice you made. And these things were pretty awesome from everything I've read. That the book I recommended last meeting about Neptune's Inferno, they talk about that at some length in there. It was quite a ship. Okay. We're getting there. I can hear the natives are restless in the back. There we go. So we're back to the pick 2, and that's what the battle cruiser was. Picking 2 out of the 3, and the odd man out was armor on a battle cruiser. So you were there with the battle cruiser to go faster and have the same main battery caliber, but not as many barrels. So it was a lighter ship, and it would go faster. And your assumptions were, number one, you got big guns that when cruisers show up, heavy cruisers with 8-inch guns, you got 12-inch guns, bam. And the second thing is they're as fast as a cruiser is. And so if they encounter battleships, they can run away because battleships are in the mid-20s or knots. These guys are about 30 knots for the battle cruisers. However, Jetland showed that there was a painful possibility that they hadn't quite considered, and that is that the battle cruisers get trapped behind the battleships. And that's what the Germans did. I don't know that they planned it exactly that way, but the battle cruisers took a heavy toll on themselves, the British battle cruisers. And they had guessed wrong. They hadn't considered what turned out to be a more important combination of events. Okay. But we're starting to get to a point now where we're mechanizing more and more what goes on the ship in order for it to shoot. The ranges continue to increase. We're getting out to 10 miles to maybe 15 miles, depending on which gun, which powder load. And the increased rate of fire, there's one piece missing here that you'll see in just a second. More ordnance on the target, that's what everybody wants, but not only more on the target, but more quickly. So, and you're still paying the price of the ranging shots that you're basically throwing away several salvos that over, under, and then on in order to get a firing solution. And this, honest to God, this is one of the devices they use for range finding. And it's, if I remember right, it's like a 20-foot base. This is the optical rangefinder. And that I'm describing it here. These 2 points there and there are the ends of what are essentially Walker binoculars. And they're able to gather the range out to a certain point. It also depends on it not being nighttime. It also depends on the weather being, it's not misty or foggy or any of those sort of things. So it works okay under certain conditions, but not all.
You know, we see those on the old ships.
Yeah. And And here's how it all kind of works together. You got everything in the same sock, but they're not necessarily tied together yet. I mean, you've got aircraft for spotting, deflection marks so that others in the ship of the line can see where you're shooting by looking at these graduations and at the range clock up here. So without communicating anything, each ship nearby this ship can see where he's shooting to try and deconflict if they need to. The spotters up here, the spotters up here are, I don't know that I'd want to be up there during all weather conditions trying to get an accurate report of range and bearing to the target. Searchlights for nighttime activity, radio, the first vestiges of radio for communication. And then here's a smaller baseline rangefinder right there. It's the same type of thing, but now the sailor is inside an enclosure.
Time frame are you talking about here?
This is the 30s. Now this is Lexington. This is in the mid 30s. And here's the fire control directors for the 5-inch battery. But again, your question, is this something you'd really want to do in heavy weather or with the shots flying around and the ship rolling and pitching? Is this the best way to do the job? The answer is almost certainly not, but that was the best they had back then. And this is what replaces it. I'm jumping ahead a little bit in the story here, but we have a director here. There's 3 to 5 guys inside this little environmental controlled, too many moving parts here. Environmental controlled, they have little hatches they can open and look. There's 2 kinds of radar here. This is the it's not surface. This is the surface radar. Then this is the height finder for aircraft. So you see this Mark 37 evolved from the Mark 34, which didn't have any radar up here. Then you see this larger screen. And finally, you see when aircraft become a problem, you see what's called the orange field. And the combination of all of those now takes the place of all that other crap I showed in the previous slide there. So we're beginning to make it easier to get good and put everything in one sock. There's a fundamental change when we have an onboard computer. There's no electronics in this thing. There are servos, but no electronics the way we see them nowadays. And the question is that I always had, and I finally got an answer to it some years ago. How do you compensate for rolling and pitching of your own ship so that the shells go where they're supposed to go? How do you time it just right? The answer is a stable vertical. It's like a pendulum. And there is a point when a ship rolls and pitches where it goes through a certain point where the stable vertical points straight down. And you use that to close the firing circuit on the guns, and they go off. As you saw in the very first picture, you could see the staggered shells. There's also a time delay so that they ripple fire out of the barrels to spread the shock load on the hull, but also so that they don't interfere aerodynamically with each other as they head out. So, I mean, we're really getting into all the details that now make the difference in being successful. Now, just as a sidelight here, I call them tour guides because I don't like the word business, but I was a tour guide on the Wisconsin for a year. And one common thing I heard over and over was that they had, because of this collision that you see here with Wisconsin, taking a chunk out of the bow, they replaced the bow on the Wisconsin. No, they didn't. This is all they replaced is this chunk. And if you stand next to the bow, you can see the weld mark. It's the only weld line that goes from the first deck, not the main deck, but the first deck down, all the way down to the keel. All the other plates are staggered like bricks in a house. And there's only one vertical weld line that goes through all of them at once. And the point I'm making here is very simple. As we were restricted by treaties to certain tonnages, you had to give something up. And one of the, what I think are pretty clever ways the United States approached the problem was the so-called immune zone. And that means you put armor where it's needed, and you also, you can size the armor such that if you get to a certain location, you cannot be damaged heavily by another ship's guns. What I mean by that is the inner edge of this so-called immune zone is the closest range where a flat trajectory shell just fails to penetrate the side armor of the ship. And the far edge of it is when plunging fire just fails to penetrate deck armor. It bounces off the deck armor. So if you can get in as fast as possible into this immune zone, you can take hits and not be disabled. So anyway, you can see some, and my point here is that not all of even a battleship is protected against damage. The important stuff is the middle third where the engine is and some of the other ancillary stuff and the magazines and the powder hoists and all that. You don't have to do anything out of the bow. You're giving up protection for the bow, which doesn't really return you much if you spend a lot of weight and weight. Okay. Now, going back, I'm just taking a step back for an instant here. I'll let you read this. When you go, if you do some research on this, how we learned to do well against the Japanese, we did it right away. But the point I'm making with all of this is that the geometries that they tested, how accurate the guns were in peacetime, were not the right ones. And basically, it was you had a raft with a great big plywood shape on it, towed by a tug at 9 or 10 knots. And for safety's sake, the battleship would run parallel to the tug and shoot just at the raft, so you didn't hit the towing tugboat. And the end result is when you compare the gunnery of, this is not Colorado, this is the target, but Colorado's gunnery, Colorado's over here, the dispersion across the range, and the same thing here, and the same thing here, that's the problem. When a ship is racing in to get in range to shoot you, the closing, his line of bearing to him closing you doesn't vary much. He's going right to the center. And that's what this shows, is that we had these great marks, how good we were in gunnery between the wars. And yet, when you actually put it into practice, what you really wanted to see was how accurately you could get this dispersion here down to a much closer. And the answer to that was radar. This is where radar comes in. We made tough choices. We got 16-inch guns. We actually had some 18-inch guns that were developed in the 20s that were never fitted to a US battleship. And then there's always been a debate, you know, the Japanese had 18.1-inch guns. If they went head-to-head with an Iowa-class battleship, who would win? And the argument basically hinges on how fast can you get the first hit. And the Japanese did not have radar on a par with ours, or for fire control or surface search or any of those things. And that's what really made the difference. But by this time, when all of these things have been developed and we've got a working system, computerized, everybody knows exactly what to do, then aircraft become the primary weapon, not big gun ships. Because even at 24 miles, they have very limited areas where you can use them in the world. And so this is, you know, we've gotten to the perfect solution. Everything is working really well. The first real engagement with this type of system of systems is for the battle, the series of naval battles around Guadalcanal. And the problem there at the beginning was that the people that really thought radar was it and would really get the first shell on target, you didn't have to do this ranging and bracketing, were the third-class petty officers that operated this stuff. The admirals weren't so sure because it wasn't in their boyhood, it wasn't in their JO tours of duty, and it wasn't in their captain of the vessel bits of kit. It started to come in at the very late 30s, and the admirals that were going to employ this stuff didn't have a comfortable feeling how well it would work. And the other thing is what I've been talking about for a little while now is how every time you make a decision, for example, bigger guns, it affects a lot of other things. I couldn't think of a better example of this. This is Wisconsin here, and this is Oklahoma. Oklahoma is a World War I dreadnought type battleship. And obviously Wisconsin is late 30s, early 40s design. And 16-inch guns, 16-inch 50s, and these were 14-inch 45s, if I remember correctly. If I'm wrong, don't tell me. But that says that we built two navies. We built the Navy that beat the Japanese early in the war. Then we built a second Navy that pushed them all the way back to Japan. This is the example of the result of all of those developments pushed together into one pack. And just a minor difference you can see in the gun deck on, I think this is HMS Victory. Sorry, break back, yeah. And what you see on the Iowa class is just the upper part of the barbette with the powder handling down in here, various types of shells. Fun fact, these barrels are designed to last for 300 full power rounds, then they have to be replaced, because the force of the shell going out the rifling extends the rifling by a certain amount. And you can see that as much as a half an inch of the inner lip protrudes from the barrel, it's about time to replace it. But
Question, well, we got the picture up
sure,
here. If I may,
you want this?
no, I was just gonna say, take a look at that turret up there and all that's associated with it. Understand that in Leyte Gulf, 24th of October, 1944, the ships that the Japanese were using were turret about like that. One turret weighed more than the destroyers and the destroyer escorts that were fighting these guys. That's just simply amazing. You stand on the deck of one of the battleships, you fire broadside, Iowa, 1984. The description that the only description I can use is what it felt like was holy.
Yeah.
You know, it's one of those things. And you could actually see the projectiles flying across on down range. And Hornfisher also brought up one more thing, if I could, is that when the Japanese were going out trying to hit the destroyers and destroyer escorts in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, they thought they were cruisers and much further out. And when they tried to put an 18-inch round through a destroyer escort, it went through.
It
all
went
right.
through, that's right.
It went out the other side.
Even the 14 inches went right on through.
Yeah, and the only thing that would stop them, that would actually detonate the projectiles, is when they hit the ship's engines, the boilers. Otherwise, it just went in one side, out the other, and you just look at the whole of the ship.
Yep. As long as you're not in that path, you're okay.
Yeah.
And the key point there is those shells are armor-piercing shells. They have a time delay, and something has to initiate that time delay, like a rapid slowing of the shell. If you've got, what is it, half-inch or less plate, shell plating on a destroyer, it's not going to slow down the momentum of that 2,300-pound shell sufficiently. Tim?
Is there any recorded length distance on the farthest jet ship you ship?
I bet there is, but I don't know what it is.
I didn't hear your question. It just saw it on Dragfest. What it was. It wasn't a US ship.
Yeah, I don't know.
Moving target.
I could lie and say I'll look it up for you, but I'm not. You're on your own. So what I've shown you here is that when we look at how things develop over time, what used to be, in this case, a 60 percentile hit was normally you had to get in as close as about 2,500 yards. They're now getting almost 3 times the distance with equal accuracy with all those advances. And this is the main battery radar, but there's a lot of stuff that you don't see below the decks. But it's a system of systems. Now here's the other Missouri photograph. This is on the starboard side, and yes, they are correct. The paint scheme on the Missouri was different on port than the starboard. They're both in dazzle camouflage, but the port side is different than the, I don't know who they thought they were kidding, but anyway, there's the 6 rounds from the forward 2 turrets on their way to the target. Give you an idea how big some of these guns are. And well, anyway, I won't be gory here. And this, I think, was taken in the Washington Navy Yard. It's a 16-inch right there, and there's a museum there now. If it is in fact the Washington Navy Yard, but you've still got the beams where they carry the barrels from one end of the facility to the other. And we still got a hammerhead crane over at the Portsmouth, at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, that was used to pull the barrels out of these turrets so you could reline them, because they get 4 full power rounds, 300 full power rounds out of each barrel before they need to be relined. There's a Volkswagen, that's always used as the reference point. This is an 18-inch gun here. This is the 16-inch 50 that's in the Iowa class. Then you go down to smaller potatoes like cruiser guns. Well, now we can accept nostalgia. I like things that make a lot of noise, whether it's cars or battleships. Both of them suit my fancy. Now we've got this. When I first put this together some years ago, this is a rail gun that's being developed. I don't know where we are on that now, whether it's worked properly or not, but we know what the battleships did. And the point came in the Vietnam War, and then later in the Gulf War, when they had their last hurrah. One of the problems they ran into, there were a couple of problems in converting the Iowas. I talked to one of my bosses at the time, was a rear admiral who oversaw, he was a SWO, so he oversaw taking off some of the armor, like where the anti-aircraft mounts were. And they had a hell of a time getting the armor off, even for the 20 millimeter guns or the quad 40 millimeter guns. Losing it, I guess. The actual gun tubs were miserable to actually cut off the ship. So even the steel was different then. I think that's it. Fortunately for you, oops, no. We got to have a shot clock here. This is at the Washington Navy Yard. Here's some pictures of 25-inch Japanese armor. And I think it was a 16-inch 50 projectile. Score 1 for the projectile, none for the armor. Punctured right through and right there. So those are still up there. I've seen them fairly recently. And that's all I got. Questions?
Got it. You just mentioned the rail gun.
Yeah.
What is a rail?
It's an electromagnetic gun that fires a projectile in a similar way that a battleship gun does, with a lot more energy, and it requires a lot more energy, but it's hypersonic. Now the barrel, the exit velocity of the barrel for the Iowa class for a 2,700 pound armor piercing shell was something like 3,000 feet per second, about Mach 2.
gunpowder actuated.
Well, they're bags of propellant. And if you look at a video of them actually loading one of the barrels, there's a rammer that pushes the warhead in. And then you have between 1 and 4 or 5 bags, 1 and 6 bags of powder that are each sealed in silk. And you can put in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, depending on how far you want to shoot. And that reduces the wear and tear on the bore. So they last longer before they have to be rebored.
Are any guns that are in use today still hand loaded? 5-inch 38s for 3.
5-inch 38s were automated.
So none that are hand loaded.
No, I can't. I'm trying to go through, and I don't know of any. Let's put it like that. And that's the key: is more rounds per minute. Part of that rounds per minute is how fast can you load it.
Yeah, that was what the exercise was. When I was on
Yeah.
quarterback back then. My crew exercised that all the time, hand loading the 5-inch 38s.
Wow. What ship?
Warrington, 8843.
DD.
Yeah, I was a gunnery officer on a Fran, and you could spit out up to 20 rounds if the crew was really well schooled.
Rounds per minute?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's lively in that gun mount, though, I'll tell you.
Yep. Well, those 6-inch 47s were something like 10 rounds a minute per gun barrel. And if you had 15 barrels on a light cruiser, that's a lot of ordnance in the air.
What's the cruiser that's in Massachusetts? That's one of the early.
Right.
Cruiser that's in Battleship Cove.
Yep. Oh, the Salem? I think it's a Salem?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That was
Salem.
one of the early.
Wasn't the sale all auto make gun?
I think it was, yeah.
They were
Auto order.
they weren't separate shot bags.
Yeah, they were,
All automated.
but it's a cruiser, not a battleship. I mean, it'd take a lot of pretty meaty guys to get those shells and powder bags for a battleship gun. Anything else? Feel free to jump in. Now, you too could be standing up here next meeting. Because I think, check with Ron, I think there are some opportunities to excel. Yeah, something that others would probably be interested in this club.
All right. For record, that concludes the meeting. We'll see you all next month.
In the mood to buy a Volkswagen, let me know. Volkswagen CC, it's a 2012, has 88,000 miles, turbo 2.0 engine.
45.
I don't know. Very, very good.
I don't know what time it started. Well, we'll see you next time, Greg. Hopefully you'll be well enough to run the show for us, so we won't be stumbling around in the dark here.
Greg, I got a question, is the file in the Zoom folder? You're muted.
He's not talking. Oh, he's mumbling.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we got you.
There was a message that the microphone on my headset wasn't working. I don't know exactly where you're gonna find it. I wish I was there. If you share your desktop, we can kind of explore together.
I don't know how to share this. Oh, you like
Yeah.
screen share?
Yeah, just share it.
Yeah, screen share.
There you go.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. What, can you open up the Zoom app? Actually, I was wondering if it gives you the path of where it was stored. Or we could just look first on the desktop. Click on the desktop. In that menu right there on the left-hand side, second item down under this PC. Just click on desktop. We still hearing each other? Hello? I'm not hearing you anymore. I can't hear you. Nope.
It's like, you know,
Can you hear me, Riley?
That was 10. Yeah. 10 was, we'll never get caught. We're so fast, we'll run away.
I can hear you good.
All right. I hear people in the background a bit better than I can hear you.
Okay, for some reason or another, I can't find the anchor mic.
All right. Well, I can hear you pretty well now. Can you, on the left-hand side under this PC, can you just click
Okay.
on desktop?
Now you can hear me
Yep.
good, right?
Mhm.
Okay. All right. So if we go to
On the left-hand side of what I'm seeing now, it says this PC. Click on desktop.
okay, this right, the desktop.
I'm not.
Okay.
I don't think I'm seeing what you're seeing any longer. I still see the Windows Explorer. Yeah. So on the left-hand side of what we're seeing now, there's a menu. At the top, it says OneDrive, and then this PC.
Is it under Zoom or where am I at? I'm sorry.
On what you're seeing, are you on File Explorer? Is that what you're seeing? No.
No.
Okay, that's what I'm seeing on my screen. Oh, yeah. So I see your mouse moving around now. Just double click on desktop there. All right. And then sort by date modified. Just click on the column that says date modified.
Where's the column at?
Yeah.
Oh, date modified. Okay. Oh, so you can sort.
Okay, so there we go. You've got a folder right there on 311. Double click on that. Here's your recordings.
Okay, so the first two recordings.
Yeah, you can just take that whole folder, go up to the desktop again.
I stared at it.
Where it says, click on where it says desktop on that. Yeah, right there. And then just take that whole folder and put it on your zip drive.
Okay. All right.
Just cut that and put it wherever you want it to be. Yep.
All right. Then how do I get this to you?
I don't know how big it'll be. Might have to wait until the next meeting.
Next meeting?
Well,
all right.
So, no, actually, there's a way. You're savvy enough. I think I can give you a link where you can just put it directly on a server inside my house.
Okay, something like a Dropbox.
Kind of, sort of, yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You know, once I get it saved, we can talk about it later or something. Yeah, so it's a lot of noise in the background here.
Understood.
You know. All right. All right. Well, I will save it and I'll put it on a separate flash drive. That way, if you need to take it, you can have it at the next meeting, or we can talk about it, and I can send it to you. You know, load it into a file or something. How did everything look for you? And
That's fine. That's good.
Yeah. All I just realized that I had that ribbon along the bottom, and it was because somebody had sent a message. And once I answered the message, the black ribbon went away. So I didn't realize that until, you know, it was after the
Oh, I didn't-
presentation.
I didn't even notice a black ribbon, so I think we're fine.
Yeah, maybe it's something I saw on my end, you know, as host.
Right,
It was
right.
controlled. All right, do appreciate it. Hope you get well.
Thank you.
All right.
Hey, don't try to do the whole thing in one shot.
Right. They were all kind of lost in Tom and, but yeah, I guess
Everybody wants to do one shot of the paint.
Yeah, patience is.
Separate. The big thing is before we go, you know, you can use a place with the back is good.
you want to get involved in that kind of stuff. And keeping stuff.
There's a little. There's other little.
I don't know, I think we're probably gonna have to sort it out and just decide how we want it. You know, who has it all. Because, I think it kind of got spread a little way.
Because it tends to not cook.
Especially after, Bill.
But, there again, won't be afraid to get your board close at the bottom, like a chime. And, wherever it has to open.
No, it's definitely something. It's wider, so I can. We can talk about how.
Try to one chime and then come to the top.
You know.
Do they recommend you put the bottom piece on first?
Collate everything and bring it back under one house.
Because I'm thinking, I would have done the bottom first and then the side pieces. It would, bottom three,
I mean, essentially all.
you get short standing.
Thinking something big to say.
Standing blocks.
It's about it. But other than that, yeah, that's a good question.
That is, the real boat probably has the side piece overlapping the bottom.
Yes, yeah.
So what do we have? We're looking at, moving the farm.
And the,
Oh, yeah.
I'm not going to.
I'm not going.
It's like-
Put it down on my mind for a while.
Are you?
Where do we go?
We'll go to that. They're discussing now.
You're eating?
No, Connor's not visiting, so she might be up by then.
I've been out since 8 this morning.
Something like that. You want me asking about the secretary versus our versus clerk versus historian. These are kind of nebulous. Do we want to bring it all kind of in one house? I don't know.
All right, so here, you like that. I think we're going to Plaza. We don't have height here, but we have a. We have to kind of go some. It's so much better.
Actually,
Trying to keep my expenses down. Well, keeping the food down is more important. And I got laid off last month. Thank you. Look at putting the bonds back on. Oh, I'm worried about the transcripts.
there's two big wood blocks that go on the house or something.
Yeah, where the block is gonna go. Put the block in.
Yeah, we can attract. Like,
That would be my recommendation. And I believe it's also the recommendation of our governor.
That's right. So now you, I got a promotion. Ended up, you hanging out.
He actually was that, some animal that was on that slide.
I did not sort of after these.
Well, I get a picture, but I don't, it's really. I like you because he's thoughtful. I'll see you next month. I think I did it right there.
I can't imagine what that would venue or something.
I was teasing you about going on a rant or something. Mystery puzzle. And you said, I don't go on a rant, no. You walked away, I said, I think I bit you in a shake.
Fracture people. Yeah. You just simply upload it, pick your size, a couple
I'm
other
not gonna
check
listen.
marks, and then I ordered this probably last week. And it was here, that's here.
Fast turnaround.
Never been
Very
there to
fast.
sit on the shelf. I don't know if there's no library conference number for it.
Well, yeah, go on. I'm putting in my order now.
Who made up the original artwork?
I did, with the help of Greg, Tim,
I'm
and
still
Sean.
working on 3D.
I came up
Not
with
the 3D printing, but
a concept,
3D.
first time, and then, we rearrange things, and, this and that, but, yeah.
I thought we got the interviewing. And none of them seem to go.
I'm done with your. We moved on to
Our problem is.
Yeah, no, I think
Systems, so we store a lot.